Hello and welcome to another episode of a Brothers Creed podcast. We're talking about motivation, experiences, and exploring the world around us. We're the Thomas brothers. I'm Ethan.
And I'm Jared, and today we're talking about kind of two different attributes. One is, well, I guess maybe not attributes, but just kind of two situations you could find yourself in, and how they may be extremes, but what are the advantages and disadvantages of each? And that is being indecisive, or maybe just not being able to make a decision versus being too hasty or impulsive in making your decisions. It's kind of a spectrum. Those are kind of the far ends of the spectrum. But we're going to talk about them and maybe share some examples. And I have a study I'm going to share. So see where that happy medium is at.
All right, let's get into it.
Let's do it.
Yeah, I'm thinking I'm back.
Most valuable commodity I know of is information.
And that, my friends, is called integrity. That's called courage. Now that's the stuff leaders should be made of.
Either you're somebody or you're nobody.
You're not the devil. You're practice.
All right, so as we're talking about kind of that indecisiveness versus hastiness, or maybe being more impulsive in your decision making, those two are really opposite tendencies when it comes to decision making. Indecisiveness for me, as I'm kind of reading through and trying to define it for myself, refers to the inability to make a decision or take an action in a timely manner.
Mm-hmm.
It is actually or often due to a lack of confidence or fear of making the wrong choice,
Mm-hmm.
or just being overwhelmed by too many options.
Yeah.
This can lead to potentially missed opportunities, lost time, frustration to both the individual themselves and those around them. Secondarily, or do you want to talk about? Do you want to talk about your definition of indecisiveness, or
Yeah.
was it different than mine?
Well, it was the same thing. Basically, that inability to evaluate information at hand and make a timely decision. One of the things I found interesting, though, was that indecisiveness is so commonly found with patients who have depression. In fact, indecisiveness is a symptom of major depression disorder that is diagnosable, like from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, they're used by psychologists. And some depressed folks might be unwilling to deal with the unpleasant stress of making a decision or any unpleasant consequences that might happen if they choose the wrong choice. So it's almost like, I'm just so depressed, I don't have the energy to decide, because if I choose the wrong thing and I have to deal with something in addition, it's just going to be too much for me. So they just don't decide, which is, in a way, is a decision in itself. But for me, I feel like sometimes I'm indecisive because it can sometimes mean closing a door. Especially, I think a lot of times, when you're right out of high school and you're going into college and you're like, oh, all the doors are open for me and all of life, and I can go do whatever I want. I could be a medical doctor. I could be an astronaut. I could be, whatever I want. But as you get older and as you kind of go down a path, you start closing doors behind you. And I think that's not entirely true. I mean, that's not totally true, but in some ways it is. Like, I went through and chose a path of financial. I did financial economics was my major, and then I got my master's in data science. So I kind of chose a little bit that route. That doesn't mean I can't change and maybe go start a business now, but it's been really hard for me to change and go back to medical school and become a medical doctor. Or if I wanted to go be a plastic surgeon, it's too far down the road. So sometimes for me, it's like I close that door. off to that opportunity some time ago. And so when I'm undecisive, I think about what opportunities I'm closing, what doors I'm closing, to be able to choose the door that I'm going through. And that's what gets me stuck sometimes. Is I'm an analyst by heart, so I try to look down the line and try to imagine all the permutations and all the what ifs, and it just can be overwhelming because there's so many variables that exist, So
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's interesting because whenever I think of indecisiveness, I think of the phrase analysis paralysis,
mm-hmm.
right? And that whole thing of like when people have too many options. Um, for a summer there before I got married, I did door to door sales, and this was kind of right on the cusp of when kind of like home automation started getting big. So mostly it was home security systems, but it was dabbling in kind of the home automation as well. So it was, you could control it from your smartphone. You could potentially change the temperature in your thermostat. You could control some of your lights on and off. There was kind of, you could look at your cameras and get notifications. And I remember I'd go door to door and present people, give them my pitch and tell them what we are doing. And then we had this brochure. And on this brochure, there was like all of the cameras and all of the sensors and all of the different things that you could give that you could attach onto the package of that these people were going to get. And it was really interesting because I went out with this one guy, and he had been really struggling to get any sales. And I was like, well, I'll go knock a couple doors with you, and we'll kind of see. And so we knocked the door, and this lady was like, "Oh, it was husband and wife were there, and it was kind of like a golden opportunity." They were like, "Oh, yeah, we've actually been looking at getting a security system. We just moved here, and we think it's really interesting." And they're like, "Well, what do you have? What do you think? What do you think?" I think they said, "What do you think would work best for our house?" And I mean, that's like the golden opportunity to just be like,
Yeah.
"Oh, well, okay, well, how many main doors do you have to the house? How many windows do you have?" Right? But he laid right into it. He was like, "Oh, well, you need this sensor and this sensor, and do you have this and that?" And it was just like he threw so much information at him that it was just like overwhelming for him. And they were like, "Oh man, I don't know. This just seems like a lot." And it was just
Yeah.
they were like, "Well, what does this sensor do that you're trying to do? And what does this one do?" And it's just like it was way too much. I'm like, dude, just I'm like, pare it back some. Just
Yeah.
start with the basics, let them say yes, and then say, hey, we have this other thing too, and then try to potentially upsell from there.
Yeah.
And I don't want to give away all my sales tactics, right? And I'm not saying it worked swimmingly and amazing for me every single time, but I just got to see kind of that analysis paralysis firsthand. So indecisiveness definitely just that you get frozen. You don't want
Yeah.
to make a decision. Impulsiveness or hastiness to the other side of that is just completely refers to making an impulsive decision without taking any time to think about it
Mm-hmm.
and to consider the facts or to weigh the options or to anticipate the potential consequences. This can lead to poor decisions being made, taking of unnecessary risk, and potential negative outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
So that is just kind of something that I don't know. It's okay. Well, if you're too indecisive, then you'll miss stuff. But if you're too hasty, then you could screw yourself.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, is there times where it's better to be indecisive, or is there advantages to being indecisive, or is it all disadvantageous to be indecisive? And so I actually went through and um, kind of pulled together a couple of the things of what are some advantages of being specifically first was indecisive. And I thought, maybe there could be some positives behind it. And so some of those positives are whenever someone is indecisive, they are they is number one, careful consideration.
Mm-hmm.
They take lots of time to very carefully consider and weigh all the options, the pros, the cons. What is going to happen if I make this specific decision in the long run? What's the effect going to be? Um, so that's potentially a good thing to have that information. The second one is flexibility. A lot of times, these people that are indecisive are more flexible because they're not really sold on one specific thing. They're always open to learning more and to digging in deeper, and maybe it makes them a little more flexible.
Yeah.
They avoid risk a lot better. Just the time that it takes to make a decision. A lot of times that it'll give you more opportunity to unfold any types of risk that might be involved.
Yeah, like I think that one clear example of that is that, well, I guess I think part of what you're talking about is like not necessarily being indecisive. You're talking. It's like there's a spectrum.
In like in a long term, right? I think some of these things.
If you're indecisive, then you're never going to make the decision, right? But if you kind of wait around a little bit and you make the decision maybe a little bit later than you would just hastily making the decision, then it can be advantageous. But that's better than never making the decision at all. Like, for example, like if you go to the car dealership, these guys are always going to hustle you, man. And they're always going to be like, oh, yeah, you got to buy this today. I don't know if it's going to be on the lot tomorrow. And then, they're like, oh, if you buy it right now. Anybody who tells me if I have to buy something within the next 24 hours or else, immediately I'm like, yeah, that's not going to happen. Because I don't make decisions like that. That is kind of
under duress.
Under duress. That's like scammy level talk to me. So as soon as someone starts putting on the pressure like that, and it's like, oh, you have to, like this immediacy of they're trying to create this like shortage in like a supply, or this immediacy that they're trying to get me to hustle and override my logical thinking so that I will buy whatever. I mean, that's a sales tactic. Clearly it's a sales tactic. So I don't take kindly to that. And I'm just like, yeah, I'm not interested now. Like you've lost all my interest in trying to hustle me for this. And so sometimes it's best to sleep on things. That's the right decision making. Say, okay, it's late night. No one's going to come, and buy this thing later tonight. So I'm just going to come back tomorrow. If the car's still here in the morning and I've slept on it and feel still good about it, then I'll do good. Sometimes it's good to get out of that high pressure situation. Whereas if you're being hasty, you're like, yeah, man, getting all worked up, and you're like, yeah. You actually overlook stuff too, when you're getting hasty like that. So
yeah, for sure. And so I think there really truly is a balance, right? And then some of the major disadvantages or I guess bad side of indecisiveness is just procrastination, missed opportunities. A lot of times you could, maybe if you had this, you saw this car at the car dealership and the guy was like, I can't promise it'll be here tomorrow. You're like, oh man, we love that car. It's a good deal. We'll sleep on it. We'll come back tomorrow. Well, you come back tomorrow and it's gone. It's like, oh, somebody bought it. Sorry. Or maybe even thinking like an investment. Sometimes you are offered an opportunity to get in on the bottom floor of an investment, and you don't, and then you lose it. You miss the opportunity.
Yeah.
A lot of times it can cause just anxiety and stress because you're just constantly thinking about something or worrying about it. Frustration to you and other people involved, those around you. And then just it can erode your own personal confidence in making decisions and the confidence that other people have in your decision making, which is dangerous, especially if you're in a partnership with someone.
Yeah, totally. I think the biggest one there is missed opportunities.
Yeah, for sure.
Is like you can miss out on lots of cool stuff if you're indecisive. Because really kind of being indecisive is, in a way, actually being decisive. You're choosing not to act. So it's like a sin of omission almost, and by choosing not to act, you will not experience these things. I also think that there's a measure of, if for someone who is indecisive, I think you need to have a measure of faith about that good things will happen. Even if something bad happens, something good could happen from that bad thing. And so you got to have some faith. And as you do that, I think you'll become less decisive. Well, maybe not hasty, but even sometimes making hasty decisions can end up good. Sometimes making very thought out and labored decisions ends out bad. It's like, just look at people. Look how many financial advisors outperform the market. Very, very, very few. Yeah. It's because it's very hard, and they're trying to be as patient and decisive as they can, but it's something that they can't really track or do very well. So, anyway, I had a interesting thing I found about, there was a preacher. He was more of like a pastor. He was kind of like more of a Christian pastor. He was talking about an indecisiveness, and he was talking about an indecisive man. And one of the examples he kind of walked through is the indecisiveness of Pontius Pilate. You know who that is?
Yeah, he was the Roman leader that tried Christ.
Yeah, he was the Roman governor over that area where Jerusalem at the time when Christ was crucified. So interesting kind of story here, and you see this indecisiveness all along. Pontius Pilate was in a tough situation where the Jewish people did not like to be occupied by the Romans. And so he was in a situation where he had to try to appease the local leaders while at the same time remaining in charge and keeping the Roman foothold in that area. And so the Roman emperor had described Pontius, or a Roman emperor had described Pontius Pilate as unbending, recklessly hard, savagely hard, and a murderer. So this guy was, had a reputation for being...
That's not a very good reputation.
Yeah. So he was unbending and savage and a murderer.
Murderer.
Exactly. So normally he was very savage, but when the decision came up between condemning Christ or holding him innocent, he just really got caught in this indecisive loop. So as many know, Christ was betrayed by Judas, and the Jewish leaders at the time in Jerusalem took Jesus to I believe they were the Sadducees, and they said, "Hey, this is who are the elite of the locals, I guess, there in Jerusalem." And they said, "Oh, this is the traitor Jesus, and this is the usurper, and all this kind of stuff." And then they said, "Well, Pontius needs to condemn him to death because he's like the actual leader around here." And the Sadducees, they didn't want to actually carry out the sentence, even though they had done that in other things like stonings and things like that. They wanted the Romans to carry out this one. So they send him in front of Pontius Pilate, and he talks to him. He says, "Art thou the king?" And Jesus answered and said, "Thou sayest it." He just kind of marveled. It says that he marveled. The scriptures say he marveled at what Christ said and how he didn't even really deny that he was the king. And then he was talking to Jesus didn't really say much else. And then Pontius was talking to some of the other guys there, and they said, "Oh yeah, he was doing all kinds of stuff in Galilee, which is where he's from, and he was doing miracles and all these kinds of things." And he says, "Oh, thank goodness. That's actually someone else's jurisdiction. That's actually Herod Antipas, who was the son of King Herod the one that tried to kill all the babies, trying to kill Jesus. So he sent he said, send Jesus over to Herod. So send him over to Herod, and Herod was just, he's just an idiot. He tried to talk with Jesus. Jesus didn't say a single word to him. Wasn't interested in talking to him at all. So Herod just mocked him. They put a robe on him, and they sent him back to Pontius Pilate and said, hey, deal with this guy. And Pontius Pilate was like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do with this guy. His wife, Pontius Pilate's wife, had a dream, and she said in the dream that it was a terrible dream and that he should let Jesus go. But he didn't want to jeopardize his political standing, so he was just in this in-between. And then he said, oh, well, there's this Jewish custom that's coming up. And, the Jews just recently welcomed Christ into the city on Palm Sunday, what we know as Palm Sunday. Surely they would not want to condemn him, and they would release Christ instead of this other guy, Barabbas. And so as the story goes, he says, per your cut, he brings them all out, and he says, here's Jesus, and per your customs, you can release someone. Who do you want to release? And he said, I find, no fault in this man. And he says, who do you want to choose? And the crowd chose Barabbas. And then they shouted, crucify him to Christ. And so then he, in his indecisiveness, does this symbolic thing where he washes his hands of the blood of Christ, which really, what does that mean? What does that actually mean? He was so indecisive the whole time. He didn't ever actually do anything. He just said, well, this is in your hands, not mine. And then we know that Christ was crucified on the cross after that, as well as scourged and many other things. So this is not to say that, if Pontius Pilate wouldn't have been indecisive, Christ wouldn't have died on the cross. We know that was prophesied beforehand, but that doesn't mean that necessarily he was like a great guy or that he was a good guy. Judas betrayed Christ, and he has gone down as the betrayer and the evil one who betrayed Christ. And so even though it was going to happen, that doesn't mean that was a good thing that person did. Interesting anecdote that I didn't know is that about 7 years later, Pontius Pilate was sent to the area called Gaul in northern Italy. And at that point, he kind of spiraled into a depression, and he ended up hanging himself. And,
interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know that. And similar fate as
Judas.
Judas, exactly. So this is pretty interesting, when you think about the indecisiveness of that man and how not being able to make a decision kind of affected a lot of things. And so,
yeah,
interesting story.
The opposite of that, hastiness or impulsiveness. This one is just being quick to make decisions, and to me, was kind of interesting. Some of the positives seemed really positive, right? Like seizing of opportunities immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Being the first to first to get in line. Decisiveness. When is decisiveness ever a bad thing?
Mm-hmm.
And confidence. It can put off if you're always yes, I'm there, this, that. It can make people around you feel like you're confident.
Mm-hmm.
Or it could be an efficient use of time because you're not constantly dragging your feet.
Yeah.
Those are all potentially like some good things with being hasty or impulsive, I guess. But at the same point, it can lead to some pretty poor decision making.
Mm-hmm.
It can lead to detrimental decisions that can have lasting regret. A lot of times if you get into something, it's hard to get out. There can be lots of negative outcomes, and it's just like to its extreme, it is just a lack of thoughtfulness altogether.
Yeah.
Which I think is very dangerous.
Yeah, I have the hastiness is kind of the desire to get things done faster makes a person restless and anxious, which in turn produces emotional setbacks of anger and stress and ultimately depression. So it's funny how like indecisiveness is a symptom of depression, but also hastiness can lead to depression too because you're not thinking through things.
Yeah.
A couple like of those old mantras, I guess, that made me think of is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Yep. Sometimes it's worth it just to take a second to make sure it's all right before you just dive in. And then haste causes waste, or haste can cause accidents as well. You think about, if you ever been doing something and someone just jumps right in and they just, they just get going and, they're a little crazy and stuff. And you're like, whoa, let's like set some ground rules. Let's talk about this. Like, you don't want to go shooting with that guy who just like whips his stuff out of the bag and just starts shooting down the range. You're like, whoa, dude, let's get set up and like, let's do this in a controlled environment. And like, let's not be crazy. You don't want that guy at the range.
Yeah, for sure. It makes me think of, I had the opportunity for several years in high school and then during college to work construction. And I remember we were doing this one project, and we were putting a metal roof on this barn, and we had just enough pieces of the aluminum roofing that we had ordered to, we had like the perfect number of pieces. Everything was perfectly laid out. But we had to cut this one piece. It was like the final piece, and it needed to be cut. And we were kind of like fighting a storm type thing, and the guys with was like, we just need to get it up there. And it was just like, it was so rushed, which we could have like thrown a tarp over, and it wasn't that big of a deal because it was going to rain. But in the haste, luckily it wasn't me. But some mistakes were made in the measurements, and then when it was cut, it was too small.
Oh.
And dude, when I tell you people were upset. There was people there were people that got yelled at so bad that they left the job site.
Oh wait, it was another worker on the job site?
Yeah, so there was like, it was like the main boss guy, and then there was like 2 or 3 of us that were helping out.
Oh, there was 2 or 3 other guys, and then it was one of the other guys.
Yeah, so I was kind of one of the not one of the more seasoned construction guys. But yeah, it was just, it's a haste makes waste, right? And it wasn't measured properly. Everybody was rushing around, and it was a mistake. Now, in the end, I mean, we had to end up like ordering a new piece and all this other kind of stuff. But, yeah.
I bet that was a tirade of just expletives.
Expletives, yeah.
that guy.
Yeah, it was fun.
Oh man, I did have one interesting study that I looked into, and this is kind of, she talks about the different ways that we make decisions. So it's a little bit, I'll just kind of read through the study here and tell you a little bit about how they did the experiment and what the experiment showed. So the research conducted by the research assistant Professor Richard Heitz and Jeffrey Shaw, Ingram, professor of neuroscience at Vanderbilt University, has found that the brain actually switches into a special mode when pushed to make rapid decisions. So the first thing you see is that neural activity of, so they have 2 games, and these 2 games that people are playing, they're monitoring their brain activity, and they have different rules about the games. So one of the games is called Fast Fury, and then the other one is something else I'll talk about in a minute. So the first thing you'll see is that neural activity of the player of Fast Fury jumps up even before the question is read. The subjective experience of getting ready that we all experience appears to be reflected in the background activity of neurons in the prefrontal cortex. In comparison, the neural activity drops to extremely low levels during high-stakes showdown while the player waits to hit the buzzer. So in like the first one, the Fast Fury, you're punished very little for answering a wrong question, but you have to hit the buzzer to be able to answer. So people just, they almost stand up and just push the buzzer right away. And if they get the wrong answer, it doesn't really matter. So it's like, it's not that much of a punishment. But in the high stakes showdown, if you hit the buzzer and you answer the wrong question, then the punishment is severe. You lose lots of points. So people react totally differently. So this picture differs substantially with the strategy theory that the brain uses the same process for all types of decisions. Our second observation in particular was really startling. He said it really flies in the face of what we thought we knew about decision making. So the different he says, return to the game show example, consider what happens when contestants in Fast Fury and High Stakes Showdown are given identical questions. The activity of the prefrontal cortex neurons increases while observers decide how to respond, but the new data suggests that this activity is amplified during Fast Fury and suppressed during High Stakes Showdown. So what this means is that identical information presented to the brain is analyzed differently under speed stress than under accuracy stresses. So they talked about when you're under a speed test, the prefrontal cortex takes over more of that decision making and information processing than when you're taking a decision in a slow, high stakes accuracy type of a situation. So it's interesting, I thought, just how the brain actually operates differently, whether that you're being slow to decide or quick to decide. Just something to think about next time. And what level of brain activity do you want to use when you're making your next decision?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's really interesting. As I was thinking through it, I was really kind of trying to decide, didn't want to just bring the listeners definitions of these two different things, but how do you need to act, right? How do we need to act in our life? How can we build our creed to not be too indecisive or not be too impulsive or too hasty in our decision making? And I mean, I think that's a personal decision, and to be completely honest, I think it depends on the opportunity.
Yeah.
And it depends on your risk tolerance and everything else that goes into it. But I think the sweet spot between indecisiveness and hastiness lies in finding a balance between taking time to consider your options and making a timely decision.
Yeah.
So it's just in between those two things. You need to have enough information to feel comfortable, but you can't take forever or you're going to lose the opportunity.
Yep, exactly.
And so sometimes you're not going to have all the information. You need to trust your gut and maybe make a decision a little bit quicker. And other times, if maybe you're getting some signals, or maybe it's a huge decision that you need to be a little bit more careful with and do a little bit more research, right? Maybe you could buy a rental house that you think that let's say you're going to buy a rental property and you're like, oh, it's such a good deal. This house is $200,000. It's a great deal. It's a great deal. And you just go ahead and you just buy it. And the mortgage is going to be with the interest rate currently as it is. I don't know. Maybe the mortgage will be $2,000 a month. And then you haven't run your comps in the area for rent.
Mm-hmm.
And, oh, hey, you can only charge $1,200 in rent.
Yeah.
Then you made that decision a little hasty because now your rent's not even covering your mortgage. And you're like, oh, shoot, now I'm just sitting on this thing and I'm in the hole.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so
Time to move.
Yeah, maybe if you would have done a little bit more research, maybe a little bit more confident in your decision, then it would have been the other way around. You could have known if it was a good deal or not a good deal. So
yep.
It's a balance.
What is it that, but also I think that That's definitely a true on the more research side, but I'm gonna do a test here for you. What was Babe Ruth's advice in The Sandlot?
Um, didn't he say like I don't know what it was.
Follow your heart, kid. You'll never go wrong.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that's
I
good
was thinking
too.
legends never die, but
Heroes get remembered, but legends never die. Follow your heart, kid. You'll never go wrong. That's what he says. So be a legend. Follow your heart, but don't make decisions too quickly. And I think that ultimately, sometimes I think God blesses us in the bad decisions and in the good decisions. So sometimes the stuff you think you're making the best decision, but really the best decision lies 2 decisions after the bad decision. You know what I mean?
yeah.
So sometimes you never know.
Or sometimes you got to train yourself and you got to make a couple really bad decisions to say like, I'm going to stop making decisions like that.
Exactly.
But all right, guys. Well, thanks for listening. This has been excellent. I think I'm going to definitely apply some of these things and maybe a more balanced approach to my decision making. I think sometimes I lean a little bit on the indecisive. I think I can procrastinate a little bit. I think that's my maybe where I sit. So I think I am going to personally lean into maybe being learning how to be more quick in my decisions. I'm not going to say hasty, but maybe learning to analyze the situation, opportunity a little bit better, a little bit faster, so that I can make quicker decisions.
Yeah. Agreed. Same here.
All right. Well, everybody listening out there, have a great rest of your day, and let's build that creed together.
Let's do it.